Okay, good morning everyone. You're not on this series of the Big Bang Theory. However, I thought this song was appropriate to talk about our next topic, which is evolution. You can take your booklets and refer to chapter 1, Evidence for Evolution. We'll be covering two things in this topic. First thing, paleontology. Paleontology will help scientists have data, and this data will then be used to make phylogenetic classification. We'll see in detail what is the data and how it can be used to do phylogenetic classification. First thing, a very basic observation. If you walk around in a forest, for example a rainforest, you will encounter many different species, different plants, different animals, also microorganisms which we can't see with our bare eye, but all of these species are around us. The whole of these species, they are part of what is called biodiversity, the diversity of biological living beings. So, basic observation, there are different species. There are many species. What questions could we ask ourselves concerning these different species? Well, here are a few questions. Why is there such a wide diversity? Have these species always existed? Has there always been so many species? Evolution is a theory which, based on different data, tries and explains why there is such a wide range of diversity. Let's do a little bit of history first. This will account for the introduction. Before the 18th, 19th century, the main explanation to why there is such a range of diversity is a theory called fixism. Fixism states that these different types of species, they have always existed and they will always exist. This is the general term, fixism. This type of theory can be found in different religions. For example, creationism is one type of fixism. You may know about Noah's Ark in the Bible, where you can see the different species. So creationism, which is a form of fixism, is an example of this theory that these different species have always existed, they haven't changed, and they will always exist. However, starting in the 18th and 19th century, some scientists have noticed things that seem to point out that species or certain animals could perhaps transform, perhaps change over time. One of these scientists is Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He's a French naturalist, 1744-1829, and with others, but he was one of the main ones. He said that some animals could transform. So an opposite theory to fixism would be transformism. In this case, animals, plants can change slightly over time. This was based on different observations, and we will look into these observations. Bear in mind, this is a very simplified, brief historical recap. You could spend hours studying the different scientists who talked about transformism. It's a very complex study. This is what would be part of something called epistemology, studying how science was made. It's very subtle, very interesting, but unfortunately we don't have time to study this. But bear in mind that I'm really giving you very simplified key points, time marks. It's much more complex. Obviously it took time for these ideas to come into place, but for your S7 4P syllabus, the key things that you can remember is this. Basically, before the 18th, 19th century, fixism was the main theory. Starting 18th, 19th century, this theory of transformism was starting to be spread through the scientific community. Let's talk about the different observations. They're mostly geological and paleontological observations. The first one we're going to look at is sedimentary rocks. You need to know how sedimentary rocks are formed to be able to understand why this was a key element in coming up with these theories on transformism. This diagram will help us explain how sedimentary rocks are formed. The formation of sedimentary rocks implies that you need a large reservoir of water. It can be a lake, it can be an ocean, it can be the sea, but you need, in any case, water. In this water, there are going to be different particles. So it can either be particles of rocks, minerals that have been brought by a river, for example. The river is going to erode mountains and rocks, and the erosion of these blocks will end up in either the sea or an ocean or a lake, for example. So these particles can be particles of sand or minerals or pieces of rock. It can also be animals which, once they die, they sink to the bottom. So in the bottom you're going to end up with particles of minerals, dead animals, so the shells, for example, of animals will remain, etc. When you have a sufficient amount of these particles, you're going to start seeing a layer which will form. The fact that these particles go to the bottom is called sedimentation. And as I said, when you've got enough, you're going to have a layer which form, because you're going to have so much pressure building up that this is going to compact the particles together. It's a bit like if you had a bucket and you're trying to fill it up with sand, and you try and push the sand to really make it solid. So this is a little bit the same thing. Instead of squashing the sand with your hand in the bucket, it's just the accumulation of particles which will exert pressure and make the sediments compact. Then time goes on, you've got more and more layers, and when the pressure is sufficient, these sediments will transform and become rock hard, and that's when we start talking about sedimentary rocks. In sedimentary rocks, there's a key element that is found, and it's fossils. Before we deal with fossils, we're just going to do a few recaps on sedimentary layers. Again, you've got in your booklet this paragraph, so you can simply complete the missing words. A few basic things. Sedimentary layers are just like plates. You can pile them up. They pile up. The sedimentary layer is formed after the sedimentary layer underneath it. So the more you go towards the top, the more recent the layer is. the more you go towards the bottom, the layer is older. As a consequence, fossils which are found in the layer are more recent than the fossils found in the layer underneath it. So the more recent fossils will be in the top layers, and the older fossils will be in the layers underneath. Let's illustrate this. This is a simplified diagram of what you could see if you went to different places in the world and you had a look at the different layers of sedimentary rocks. So two things. We've got different species of trilobites. Trilobites because if we were to do a sketch rapidly, they have 3 lobes. That's why it's called a trilobite. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 lobes. So each layer has a specific species, and next to this you can see that there is a name: Lower Cambrian, Middle Cambrian. These names, they correspond to different geological periods of time. Just for your general knowledge, geologists have built the geological timescale. I'm just going to show you this. There's a very good internet site by the Geological Society of America where you can see this timescale. So it starts, if we zoom in a bit, it starts here at 4.5 billion years, so 4,500 million years, and so this is going towards more recent times, and we end up with today here. So the last period is called Holocene, and you might recognize different names. For example, Jurassic, you might have heard of the film Jurassic Park. So during the Jurassic there were obviously dinosaurs. So if you have any doubt of a period of time in geological times, you can always have a look at this geological time scale to know where you are in the long life of planet Earth, if I may say so. Back to this. So these represent different periods of time, and the idea is that if we take these fossils at the top, so we just saw how sedimentary layers were formed, so we know that this last layer is more recent than the one underneath it, this first layer being the oldest one. So again, a very basic observation. If we look at the shapes of these different trilobites, we can see that during geological times their shapes change. So trilobites have not always been the same. This would explain that animals transform. This is an idea that animals will change, and this is what's behind the theory of transformism. This is an example with trilobites. This is a second example with species part of the ammonites group. So same thing, we can see that throughout time these species have different shapes. Some species disappear, some appear. So again, we don't have species which stay the same forever. They are different shapes, so there has been transformations during geological times. This is fact number 2. You can complete in your booklets. the shape of fossils changes over geological times. This is some of the key elements behind the observations which led to the theories on transformism. Later on, Charles Darwin, a few decades after Lamarck, he also came up with ideas of transformation, and where Lamarck only thought that it was one animal, one species, in Darwin's approach, he had this idea that there was a common ancestor, and that this common ancestor would have different descendants, and these descendants will change over time, and we would have new forms, new species. So this would be a common ancestor here, and this common ancestor could lead to, throughout his descendants, to different species, which will then do new branches towards different species. So maybe one of the key approaches of Darwin is that he had this idea that there was a common ancestor, and that most species were related to one common ancestor. Again, this is a little bit simplified. Today's theory of evolution is based on many scientific data. In Darwin's time, for example, they didn't know about DNA, so there were some things that seem are not correct with today's data, but for the key thing of the common ancestor and the descendants, that was a very nice idea that Darwin developed in his time. Again, if you're interested in epistemology and how science was made, there are many books which explain and talk about Darwin and how the theory of evolution changed and got more and more precise over the years with more and more data. That was for the introduction. The key. Sorry, we're still in the introduction. No, we've moved on. I'm messing around. So paleontology. A few key things. So it's the scientific study of what existed before the Holocene epoch. So roughly 11,700 years before present. And paleontology is based on the study of fossils. It's different from archaeology. Both terms are usually confused. Archaeology is the study of human activity. So you analyze artifacts, architecture, but it's not as such the study of fossils. This is a more recent period, and it only concerns humans, whereas paleontology is the study of all forms of life based on the study of fossils. You won't be asked these types of definitions in back exercises, but it's just for you to have some background knowledge. Okay, let's have a look at different types of fossils. You might recognize this. It's not far from Manosque. It's near Digne-les-Bains. It's the Dalle aux Ammonites. So a huge outcrop of rock with with many ammonites on it. So in this case, we simply see that we have the shell of the organism which has been preserved in a certain way. You can also have plants. You might have recognized a fern here that has been fossilized. These are insects which are in amber. I don't know if you know this. Amber is simply the sap of trees which has trapped these insects, and then the sap has hardened and been transformed into a rock. Footprints. And this is something called a stromatolite, all these waves, they've been created by bacteria. Bacteria who do photosynthesis, and because they do photosynthesis, it has an impact on the concentration of CO2, and it's responsible for building these limestone compartments with these different lines. The reason I showed you the two last ones, the stromatolite and the footprint, is that you haven't got any remains of the organism itself. So a more large definition to fossils is that it's either parts or the whole part of a organism which has been preserved, mostly in rocks, but it can also be the activity. So for example, a dinosaur walking around, it's considered a fossil even though there is no remains of the actual dinosaur itself. And same thing for stromatolite. This is a consequence of what these bacteria have built, but it's not actually the bacteria itself. If you go to Australia, you can actually see modern stromatolite. So it's these huge blocks which are a few centimeters, 30 to 40 centimeters high, and what's surprising is that it's millions of bacteria which are responsible for these limestone blocks. So these were examples to illustrate the definition of fossils. So it's the trace or the remains or the impression of living things. And you've got different examples: bones, shells, exoskeletons, stone imprints, etc. So you can write these definitions in your booklet. Again, fossil, I highly doubt you'll be asked to give the definition. However, you must know how fossilization occurs, and that is something that you can have in a back exercise. So paleontology, archaeology, fossils, it's just for your background knowledge. However, fossilization, that's something you need to know. This was part of a back exercise, so we'll cover the questions afterwards. It's in your booklet. It's also a Eurobio document, so I'm simply going to explain it and give you a few labels. So you can probably recognize something that looks a bit like a ammonite. It's a nautilus. So step one, we have a living animal, here a nautilus. So for the purpose of the storytelling, let's call him Jack. So Jack lived a happy life. He was swimming around in the ocean, but unfortunately one day he died. He then sank to the bottom. This is step two, where we can see poor Jack, which has died and has sunk to the bottom. So the soft parts will decompose, however the shell will be preserved. And you can see that it's starting to be covered by sediments, particles. It can be sand, it can be pieces of rock which will cover the nautilus. So the shell of our good friend Jack is going to be preserved in these layers under sediments, so the shell is buried. A bit later on, again for the purpose of storytelling, let's call this fish Annabella. Annabella is swimming around happily, but she has no idea that underneath her there is the remains of our good old friend Jack. Interesting thing, this shell it won't be exactly the shell which is preserved, because this shell will be transformed, will be mineralized. So it's not actually the bone-like shell you have, it's a transformation of this bone-like shell into a different type of rock with different minerals. Annabella will also die. She will also sink to the bottom, and she will constitute a next layer. So in step 5 the particles will harden, and step 6 you have different layers, and in the different layers you will have different fossils. And T is for the time scale. So as we said, towards the top it's the more recent, towards the bottom it's the older layers. You can also call them strata. So if we were to label them in age, so number 1 would be the bottom one, oldest, number 2 a little bit more recent, and number 3 would be the most recent. So this diagram, you need to know the different steps. So this is the process of fossilization. Yet we've seen how fossilization occurs, but we haven't answered the question, so we still have to do that. So the two questions which were related to this diagram, in this case figure 4. First question was the name of the process, so it's called fossilization. And second question, you had to give the conditions which are necessary for this process. There are two things. The parts have to be covered in sediments. It has to be done quickly, otherwise the remains could also decompose. An important thing, if it's the case of a skeleton or a shell, you have this process of mineralization, so the transformation into minerals, into a type of rock. These are the two key points for this process. There we are, you know the process of fossilization, so we are going to move on. Second big part, phylogenetic classification. This might be a new word for you. You might have very briefly talked about it in S5, but maybe just briefly. Let's investigate and see what it's all about. It starts off with these kinds of diagram. So this is called a phylogenetic tree. We have different things. We have the different species at the top here. So these phylogenetic trees, they can either be done with specific species or they can be done with groups of species. So for example, mammals, turtles, etc. But it could also be done with, I don't know, with a zebra, an elephant, a rat. So you could also do it for specific species. A word you maybe are not familiar with is the word clade. So mammals, for example, they're a group of species which have specific characteristics, and mammals, they constitute a clade. It's one group of species which are closely related. To build these trees, you need to compare characters. The characters can be seen here. So do they have vertebrae, do they have jaws, etc. Do the species have bony skeletons? What is very important to understand is that a phylogenetic tree simply states which species or which groups of species are more closely related than others. For example, from this tree we can see that crocodiles, they are more closely related to birds than they are to mammals, for example. If we were to compare this to a family tree, basically birds and crocodiles could be cousins, and mammals would be very, 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 very distant cousins. So in terms of relationships, crocodiles will be more closely related to birds than they are to mammals. What characters are used? Well, it can be physical characteristics, it can be genetic sequences, behavioral traits. There are many things that can be used to build phylogenetic trees. And we will actually see different types. We will look at physical characteristics, but we'll also compare DNA sequences to build these different trees. Last concept, very important, a derived character. A derived character is a character which is shared by a specific group of individuals. We could use an example. If we look at this tree, we can see that mammals, the group of mammals, which is a grouping of different species, they all have in common one character, which is the presence of hairs. Therefore, we can say that hairs is a derived character for mammals. That is to say, mammals all share this character. They all have hairs. So a derived character is a character which is specific to a group of species or to a species. I said earlier on that the very important thing is to understand that a tree simply tells you which species or which clans are closer in terms of relationships, family, if I may say, relationships. But this is based on a very simple principle. So this basic principle is the following. If two species or clans share more common characters, then they are more closely related. So the more characters a species shares with another, the more closely related they are. The best thing for you to understand is to do an example. Therefore, we're going to do an example together based on the observations of the skeletons of different species, and this should normally really help you understand how a phylogenetic tree is built. This is extremely important for the Bac and also for biology, more generally speaking. You would definitely have something on the lines of, you have this data and you need to build the phylogenetic tree or understand a phylogenetic tree. So very, very important thing you need to be able to do. There are different steps. Bear in mind that scientists always build theories and diagrams based on data. So the first thing, we will have to pile up data, and we'll observe skeletons to do that, which will help us complete the derived characteristic grid. Once we've got our data, we will then be able to build the phylogenetic tree, and thirdly, we'll also build what is called a nested grouping diagram. A nested grouping diagram is simply another way of showing relationships, just like the phylogenetic tree, based on the same data. So basically they tell you the same thing, but the way of presenting it is simply a little bit different. Are you ready? Here we go for the building of a phylogenetic tree. So as always in science, we need to gather data. We can observe these different skeletons. The first thing we can say is simply state the name. So you can pause for a few seconds if you want to guess which species is which. Let's do it. So the first one, you probably recognize, it's a bird. It's a pigeon. The second one is a type of fish. It's a trout. The third one is a lion, and the fourth one is an eagle. So we've got a group of species, and we've got different skeletons, and our aim is to try and see which species is more closely related to others based on these observations. So you're probably thinking that the eagle and the pigeon are more closely related. You're right. The idea here is to really have precise scientific knowledge which will enable us to say that. In our analysis, we'll have to talk about the different legs or arms of these animals. So again, this is a close-up of the different species. So we still have 4: the pigeon, the trout, the lion and the eagle. So we are now going to simply observe these skeletons and see what they have in common and what differences. Our aim is to try and find the common characteristics. Nevertheless, we still have to learn a bit more before actually observe everything. You need to know a little bit what a pentadactyl limb is. So it's a way of organization of the limbs. So species which have a pentadactyl limb will have a limb which is organized in this specific way. You have first one bone, then you have 2 bones, and then you have a set of bones with between 10 and 20 perhaps. The pentadactyl limb will always be organized in the same way. 1 bone, then 2 bones, and then a set of bones. If you have this organization, then you have a pentadactyl limb, meaning that you've probably inherited this organization from a common ancestor. We're now doing the detailed derived characteristic grid. We need to complete this grid first before we actually do the phylogenetic tree. You need 2 things in these types of grids. You need the different species. So you need to have them here so that we can look at the different characteristics they have. So we've got 4 species: pigeon, trout, lion and eagle. And we're going to look at 5 characteristics. Do they have a skull or not? Do they have a backbone or not? Do they have ribs or not? Do they have the pentadactyl limb or not? And do they have a breastbone and wishbone? These types of grids, you simply state, does the species have the characteristic or does it not have the characteristic? So first one, it's quite obvious. Do they have a skull? The answer is yes. 1 here, 1 there, 1 here, 1 there. So all these species have skulls. So in the grids you can either say present, or you can also write a plus symbol to state that the species has the characteristic. So for the skull it is the case. Now then, what about a backbone? Do these species all have backbones? Again, the answer is yes. They all have a backbone. And while we're at it, they all have ribs. It's a bit camouflaged, but if you look at the picture in your booklet, you can see that they all have ribs and they all have a backbone. Again, we're going to state that they have a backbone and ribs. For the moment, we can't really say which species is closest to another species because they all have the same number of characteristics in common. They all have 3 characteristics in common: skull, backbone and ribs. That is why we need more characters to determine which species is closer to another species. pentadactyl limb, if we look closely, we can see that here we have one bone, here we have two bones, and then we have a set of bones. For the lion we have one bone, two bones, and a set of bones. For the eagle we have one bone, two bones, and a set of bones. Whereas for the trout we have one bone, and then we have this set of bones. So a trout does not have the pentadactyl limb organization just like the others. This is a difference, and we're going to state it. The trout does not have the characteristic. The characteristic is absent, or you can also use a minus symbol. Lion present, eagle present. We've moved on. We now can separate the trout from the other three. We know that the pigeon, the lion, and the eagle are more closely related than the trout. And to try and see if there are different relationships between the lion, the eagle, and the pigeon, we can look at other characteristics. In this case, the breastbone, which is this bone here, we can see that the eagle and the pigeon have this breastbone. They also have the wishbone. However, lions, nothing, trout, nothing. So this breastbone, which is a fusion of some part of the rib cage, is not present in the trout or the lion. We can finish completing our grid. Trout and lion don't have a characteristic, so the characteristic is absent. However, the eagle and the pigeon have this characteristic. Alright, we've got our grid. We can now build the phylogenetic tree. You need to have your grid somewhere. A phylogenetic tree has different branches. It also has characteristics, and it also has intersections, points, and we'll explain what this means for this specific type of tree. So first thing we can place are different characteristics. Skull, backbone, ribs, they are shared by all these species. Therefore, we come to a point here. This green point symbolizes a theoretical common ancestor. It's because of the characteristics these species have, we can assume that they all had a common ancestor which had a skull, a backbone, and ribs. So this point here, if you've got the characteristics placed before it, that means that this point here has these characteristics. And this point here is a theoretical point to show that the most recent common ancestor of the lion, the pigeon, the eagle, and the trout has had these three characteristics. A slight point of awareness: these common ancestors, they are not fossils. It is usually thought that a fossil has to be the ancestor of different species. This is not the case. It's a quite classic mistake. Fossils in these types of trees are treated just like any other species. Just to give you an example, imagine we have pigeons today, but imagine that for some reason pigeons disappeared. In the records we would have bones of pigeons, but we wouldn't have pigeons anymore today. So if we had fossils of pigeons, that doesn't mean that pigeons would be the common ancestor to other species. They simply have disappeared and are not here anymore. So just to say that fossils in these types of trees, they're just considered like any other species, and they're not a common ancestor. A fossil is just one individual which died and was preserved in certain conditions, but it's not a common ancestor. Unless you're very, very lucky and this fossil actually did correspond to the common ancestor, but the probability of that is really, really low. Once you've set the oldest ancestor for the species, you can then move on. So these trees, they're based on characteristics and the number of characteristics species have in common. So let's see if there's differences when we get to the pentadactyl limb. There is. We can see that the pigeon, the lion and the eagle, they share a characteristic that the trout doesn't have, and that is the pentadactyl limb. Therefore, we will place the characteristic after the most recent common ancestor, because the ancestor of the trout didn't have that characteristic. And that's going to enable us to do two things. The first one is we'll be able to isolate the trout, and the trout from this common ancestor will have its own branch. And we can go to the next point. So this is the next common ancestor, and this time this common ancestor has 4 characteristics. So this point here has all the characteristics before it, so pentadactyl limb, ribs, backbone and skull. And this common ancestor is the common ancestor to the lion, the pigeon and the eagle. We can now move on and see if between these 3 species we can find more differences. Is it the case? Yes, it is the case. We can see that the lion has 1 character less in common than the pigeon and the eagle. In other words, the pigeon and the eagle, they share more common characteristics. We can place this characteristic after the most recent common ancestor of the lion, the pigeon and the eagle, and we can isolate the lion, because the lion will have its own branch from this most recent ancestor. We can now place a new common ancestor, and this time this common ancestor will have all the characteristics which have been stated before it. So breastbone, wishbone, pentadactyl limb, ribs, backbone, skull. And this common ancestor is the ancestor of the pigeon and the eagle. And we can finish completing our tree. So this common ancestor will branch into 2, pigeon and the eagle. Obviously the pigeon and the eagle will have different characteristics. We're not going to detail them, but we can say that if we only study these characteristics, we know that they are more closely related. Let's do a recap on this. So this is really what your phylogenetic tree looks like at the end. On the branches you have the species of interest, the species you want to compare. Now that we've done the tree, we can say that the eagle is more closely related to the pigeon. They have a more recent common ancestor. If we still talk about the eagle, it's more closely related to a lion than it is to a trout, because they have a more recent common ancestor. And the trout is less closely related than all these 3 together. Well, that's how phylogenetic trees are built. There is one last thing. Pigeon and eagle can actually be swapped around. It won't change anything to the meaning of the tree, so I can simply swap them round. The meaning will still be the same because they have the most recent common ancestor here. So this tree or the tree before they are equivalent. We can still get the same information. Phylogenetic trees are one thing, and very similar are nested groups. They are based on the same data and they explain the same things, which species is closest to which one, but it's simply a different way of presenting this. So again, we're going to do the same thing. So you need to have your characteristic grid somewhere. We're now going to explain how nested grouping diagrams work. You start off with a huge box where you're going to put all your species. In this big box, you're simply going to say that all the species in this box, they have three things: skull, backbone and ribs. And in this big box, you're going to try and make smaller boxes. So your first box would be animals which have skull, backbone, ribs, but they also have pentadactyl limbs. Now that we've done that, we can place the trout, which the trout is placed here. This means that it has these three characteristics because it's in this box, but it doesn't have pentadactyl limbs. That's why it's not placed in this box, it's placed in this one. If we move on, it's just like the trees. You always look at the species which have more characteristics in common to put them in smaller boxes or closer branches for the phylogenetic tree. We can now do a smaller box with breastbone and wishbone. So the meaning of this, the characteristics, they're really for the box they are attached to. Now that we've done this, we can place the lion. If the lion is placed here, it means that the lion has the skull, the backbone, the ribs and the pentadactyl limbs, but it doesn't have breastbone and wishbone. And finally, in this last box, we've got eagle and pigeon. They're more closely related and they will have wishbone and breastbone, but they also have pentadactyl limbs and they also have skull, backbone and ribs. So we can make out the same meanings as for the phylogenetic tree. The eagle will be closer to the pigeon in terms of relationships. The eagle will be closer to the lion than it is to the trout. And we can see that the trout is not as closely related to the lion, the eagle and pigeon than the lion and the eagle and the pigeon are closely related together. So it's always the same principle. If two species have more characteristics in common, they're more closely related. Very clear example here. Eagle and pigeon, they have more characteristics in common, they're more closely related. Those were the two main things: building a characteristic grid and making a phylogenetic tree. This is very important. You can check your knowledge and understanding of this with the Bac exercise from 2015. It's the same principle. The only thing is that you don't have access to the skeletons, so scientists have already done the observations for you. So plus means it has the derived characteristic, minus means it doesn't have it, so it doesn't have the characteristic. So, I'll let you go through the Bac exercise, and as always, if you have questions, you can either email me or send me a pronote message. I'll be happy to answer the questions. I'd like to finish with two things. We talked about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck earlier on. There are other scientists, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, Cuvier. There are other French scientists who worked in the what is now the National Natural History Museum in Paris, and it used to be Royal Gardens and nature science universities. If you happen to go to Paris, you can have a look at la Galerie de Paléontologie et d'Anatomie Comparée. So you probably recognize that in English it's Paleontology and Compared Anatomy. And they had access to these collections of skeletons, and that enabled them to see that there were differences and common features with species, and that's also how these ideas of evolution started germinating in their brains. This is another view of the gallery. So when you enter the gallery, it's quite striking that they all have common features when you look at the skull, the backbone, and the ribs, but if you look closely, there are details. There are differences if you look in the details. And a song to finish, as always now. I've discovered that you can actually make music using bones. So we're just going to have a look at this video only a few seconds to finish.